Thank you, Professor Thomas, fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a terrific opportunity to deliberate with you on this topic. I was quite fascinated with one of the slides that Carlos flashed on the contribution of various countries in peacekeeping forces. And out of 5 top countries, 4 were South Asian countries. India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And the number 1 was Ethiopia. That's quite fascinating. Since Professor Ruchita and Carlos deliberated on the peacekeeping part of it, let me move this discussion to a different points. And I'll do this by highlighting 4 areas. One is to put the conflict and its sort of cost in the context. And what is the sort of global context of conflict, global extent of conflict and violence. I'll also argue for our age-old proverb, which is called prevention is better than cure. So focusing on the conflict prevention. And then I'll argue for a new paradigm for peace building, and then role of South-South cooperation. So just to put the things in context, you must have seen this report, but just to remind you, a recent report on the Global Peace Index in 2018 published by the Institute of Economics and Peace based in Sydney mentioned that in 2017, the average level of global peacefulness has deteriorated in 92 countries out of 163 countries that they ranked in the peace index. Predictably, the Middle East and North Africa, MENA region remained the world's least peaceful region. But interestingly, Europe, which has been the world's most peaceful region for a long time, also deteriorated in peacefulness for 3 consecutive years. And similar trend is also found in South America. So these are, in a way, sort of revelation by this report. The global economic impact of conflict and violence was estimated to be mind-boggling, US dollar 14.76 trillion in 2017, which is equivalent to 12.4% of the global GDP, which means that every person per capita cost would be like 1,988. That's the cost of current global conflict in 2017. Can you imagine that 68% of the GDP in Syria is spent on conflict, managing a conflict, and so 63% for Afghanistan and 51% for Iraq. So that's the kind of context in which we are talking about peace building and conflict management. In the sort of preparation for this deliberation, I was going through some of the papers, and it was fascinating to also see that there is no dearth of wisdom to predict that which country or a sub-region within a subnational region would get into a conflict region. What are the early warnings? In all contexts, there was a sharp increase in inequality, economic, social, as well as political power between the subnational regions, either in the context of ethnicity or religions or religious sects, and people at large. So there's a clear-cut indicator where there is an increased inequality. Second is perception of being subject to blatant injustice by certain sections by the people. So that's a perception by majority of the people or minority of the people that they are facing some injustice. And then marked deterioration of or undermining of democratic institutions and processes. which otherwise these institutions mediate between different interest groups, and therefore reducing the chance of conflict. And fourth one is the dramatic deterioration of civic liberty and spaces for civil society. So these are some early warnings which could be seen in more or less across the globe in all the conflict regions. So indeed, the inequality and exclusion manifest most starkly in political policy arena related to the access to political power and governance, land, water, extractive resources, delivery of basic services, justice and security. So it is possible to predict whether the countries or a sub-region within a nation could get into a conflict region. So what are the new paradigm for peace building? Within this understanding, there is now a kind of paradigm shift in the way peace building and conflict management strategies are now being considered. First of all, this is premised on the understanding that violence and conflict cannot be resolved by short-term partial solutions. And in the absence of institutions that provide people with security, justice, and developmental opportunities. So the point made by Mr. Deepak is very pertinent here. This is perhaps true that the primary responsibility for preventing action to conflict rests with the states, particularly through their national policies. However, in today's context, states are often one actor among many. And states are increasingly called to work with each other and with other actors to keep their countries on a pathway to peace. So it is the ability or inability of the state to work with a range of actors within the national context is extremely important. And this is possible when there is a strong democratic state in place which can sort of mediate and take into consideration the interest of various conflicting groups. The third one is the nexus between development, peace, and security. And this takes concrete form towards an inclusive approach to conflict prevention. The development dimensions must include economic, social, as well as political, particularly focusing on the strengthening democratic institutions. So the examples given by Ruchira of building institutions, strengthening democratic institutions in other countries becomes an important examples in the South-South cooperation. And the narrow prism of looking at security from a only military perspective must be sort of broadened enough to include the human security, along with, which has become increasingly important, is the environmental and climate change security, as well as energy security. And these are becoming sources of many international conflict. So this understanding is fortunately now fostered in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore, here comes the role of South-South cooperation. And all the southern countries are now subscribed to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in this framework that enables and which bestows upon the greater responsibilities to the southern countries and thus greater relevance to South-South cooperation in the peace building and conflict management. So the emerging economies have become major players in provisioning tailored and long-term assistance to conflict-affected countries within the framework of South-South cooperation. There's an example of Brazil, example of South Africa, example of India are very pertinent here. And interestingly, all these three countries are democratic countries, and they are providing long-term support in many conflict-ridden countries. And there's its broader development cooperation growing. I mean, this is coming out of perhaps, the understanding that the broader development context would provide also a commercial interest, like, promoting trades, and that becomes one of the tools for promoting economic development. But also, the foreign policy aspiration for regional stability, and legitimately a bigger role in global governance. The emerging economies, particularly India, Brazil, South Africa, have promoted, as Ruchira was mentioning, some of the principles of South-South cooperation, which is in a way sort of alternative model and approaches that prioritizes national ownership and capacity building, and it is sort of intrinsically linked to the development cooperation approach, which has taken a human approach to peace building. And the last point is the emerging economies have also favored a consent-based and triangular intervention. So here comes the question of, Mr. Kala, you talked about where are the difficulties, in terms of putting in practice the principles of South-South cooperation, and non-interference becomes a barrier in that case. But there comes the question of the role of agencies like UN and other trilateral development, where a consensus-building approach is generated through institutions like UN agencies. So just to conclude the process, my deliberation here is to say that it is possible within the normative principles of South-South cooperation to make investment for building peace in the long term. Let me stop here and be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for your very important thoughts on the conceptual framing of peace building and conflict prevention, which then, and how they interlink with the principles of South-South cooperation. So we have some time left, and please let's have some statements, questions from the audience. We'll take a number of statements, and then everybody here from the panel will have a chance to respond. 1, 2, 3. Who's got the microphones, please? The lady in the center. There, yes. Please kindly introduce yourself.
I'm Shireen, an entrepreneur from ID Solutions. So very good evening, all of you. And thank you so much for such a fascinating talk and discussion. So I want to know one thing. In this era of nuclear power, arms and wars, where US, the biggest arms exporter, is involved in almost in every war. So my question is how feasible or effective is this talk of peace building, peace management without big players like US, China, or Russia?
Okay, thank you. Very clear question. The gentleman here up in front, please.
Yeah, Dr. Balakrishnan, former ambassador. You mentioned about early warning of state breakdown, if you might say, precursor to a conflict. United Nations can't intervene. It has no mandate at that point. The only mechanisms which are available are, for example, through the ILO, through labor conditions, conventions relating to freedom of association, trade union rights. If they are infringed, that provides a channel to intervene in UN body. The other is the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights, where you have the periodic reviews. Apart from that, there is very little the UN can do at a precursor stage. Once a conflict situation arises, then there is the additional Protocol 2, the Geneva Convention, which is based on humanitarian principles. That is something which all countries of the South should support. Secondly, in a drastic case of state failure, I would think that we could invoke the mechanism of the Trusteeship Council. Rather than a coalition of XYZ countries, the Trusteeship Council type of structure would have much more credibility and support than, for example, cases where in the Balkans, Yugoslavia broke up. It was a preferred solution of the EU. And now you have preferred solutions of Iraq and Syria, which are being pushed by one or other players, which is not going to be sustainable. So just like your reaction to that.
Okay, thank you. Pointing to the UN system and trusteeship council, which is dormant at the moment. The gentleman up here, the professor from South Africa.
Hello, 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 hello. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
It's much better.
Hello? Am I correct in between, there are different definitions between what Carlos presented and what Katsuf has presented in terms of measuring the violence and the conflict. You're measuring also internal violence, not conflict as defined by Carlos. But the difficulty is for us in our initiatives is naturalizing the concept of conflict management instead of framing it as regrettable that we have to go that way. Now, 4 little points. If peace is the end of wars, there has been no war